Some places aren't abandoned. They're just waiting. The storm had swallowed the road hours ago. I could barely see 5 feet ahead, my headlights cutting through a thick curtain of snow, but even that wasn't enough. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling my car as if trying to force me off the road. The dashboard flickered. Temperature, -22 F. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles stiff from the cold. This town wasn't on most maps. Blackridge, Alaska population? Less than 100. I had spent weeks digging through old records, chasing the legend of a school that had been left to rot for nearly 50 years. The Whispering School, they called it. A place where children had once walked in, but never walked out. It sounded like a ghost story. But ghost stories usually had some truth buried in them. I had made a career of chasing the things people refused to talk about. Disappearances. Haunted places. Forgotten tragedies. Asterisk. That's why I was here, driving through a blizzard that seemed to want me dead. I checked the GPS, 3 miles left. The motel was just ahead. A small, flickering neon sign barely visible through the snow. Blackridge, and the moment I pulled into the lot, my tires crunched against ice, the car skidding slightly before stopping. I stepped out. The cold hit me like a punch. The motel was even smaller than I expected. A single-story building, only 6 rooms, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. I hurried inside, shaking off the cold as the doorbell jingled above me. Behind the counter sat a man in his 60s, his face carved with deep lines. His name tag read Frank. He didn't look up from his newspaper. "You're late," he muttered. I frowned. "You were expecting me?" He finally met my eyes. "You're the reporter, right? The one asking about the school?" I nodded. Frank sighed, setting his paper aside. His hands were rough, his knuckles scarred like someone who had worked with him his whole life. "People don't go near that place," he said. "They shouldn't." "Why?" I leaned in slightly. He hesitated. "Because some places aren't abandoned," he said, his voice lower now. "They're just waiting." A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. I pulled out my notebook. "Tell me what you know." Frank exhaled sharply. "Nothing I say will stop you, will it?" I shook my head. He rubbed his temple. "Then get some rest. If you're really going there tomorrow, you'll need it." He slid a room key across the counter. "Room 4. As I walked toward my door, the wind outside picked up again, rattling the windows. The school was out there, hidden in the snow, waiting. And tomorrow I would find it. The school stood like a forgotten grave, half buried in the snow. Its brick walls were cracked, the windows shattered, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. But somehow, it still felt alive. Ethan Carter pulled his coat tighter around him as the wind howled through the trees. His gloved fingers ached from the cold, but he didn't care. He had come too far to turn back now. His boots crunched through the thick snow as he approached the front doors. Massive wooden slabs, their surface worn and splintered. Rusted chains once held them shut, but they had been cut long ago. By whom? He didn't know. Ethan hesitated. Something about this place made his chest feel heavy. Maybe it was the way the building seemed to lean toward him, as if waiting. Or maybe it was the eerie silence. The town was just a few miles away, but here, there was no sound, no wind, no rustling trees, not even the distant cry of a bird. Only stillness. With a deep breath, he grabbed the handle and pulled. At first, the door refused to budge, frozen in place by years of ice and decay. He braced his shoulder against it and pushed harder. Wood groaned. Something cracked. Then, with a sudden, violent snap, the door swung open. A blast of air rushed out, colder than the blizzard behind him. Ethan stepped inside. Darkness swallowed him whole. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dust-filled air, revealing long, empty hallways lined with rusted lockers. The floor was covered in debris, broken tiles, scattered papers, a single, abandoned shoe. Desks and chairs lay overturned in the classrooms, as if the students had left in a hurry. Something about the air felt wrong. Not just cold, but heavy, thick, like the walls were pressing in on him. His breath formed clouds in front of him as he whispered into his recorder. Asterisk, Ethan Carter. February 12th. I made it inside. Everything is untouched, as if the school just froze in time. Asterisk. His voice sounded too loud, bouncing off the walls. He stepped forward, his boots echoing in the emptiness. Every creak of the floor sent a chill down his spine. Then, he noticed something strange. The cold outside had been brutal, but inside it was worse. His fingers stiffened even inside his gloves, his breath coming out in sharp, white bursts. It felt like the temperature was dropping the deeper he went. He swept his flashlight along the walls, illuminating faded posters, rotting bulletin boards, and classroom doors with peeling paint. Some of them were still slightly ajar, revealing rows of dusty desks and old textbooks with curling pages. Then he saw it, a single desk, right in the middle of the hallway. It stood alone, perfectly positioned, facing him, as if waiting. Ethan swallowed hard. He had seen weird things before. Abandoned buildings often held eerie surprises, but this felt deliberate. His fingers hovered over his camera. He lifted it, clicked the shutter. The flash exploded in the darkness, lighting up the hallway for a brief second. And that's when he saw it. A shadow, at the far end of the corridor. Gone in an instant. His heart pounded. He swung his flashlight toward the spot, but there was nothing there. Just empty space, the same dust-covered tiles and broken lockers. Ethan took a shaky breath. It must have been a trick of the light. The mind played games in places like this. At least, that's what he told himself. Still, something inside him whispered, "You shouldn't be here." But he had a job to do. Gripping his camera tighter, Ethan took another step forward, deeper into the school. Behind him, the front doors slowly, silently swung shut, and the cold grew deeper. The air inside the school was thick with dust, the kind that clung to the throat and made every breath feel heavy. Ethan pulled his scarf up over his mouth and swept his flashlight across the room. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing old wooden desks, some overturned, others still standing, as if waiting for students who would never return. The silence was unnatural. It wasn't the quiet of an empty building. It was deeper, heavier, like the whole place was listening. Ethan stepped forward, his boots crunching against shattered glass from a broken window. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow, before fading into nothingness. He exhaled, his breath misting in the icy air. This was wrong. It was colder in here than it had been outside. He moved toward a row of lockers, their metal doors rusted and dented. Some hung open, revealing tattered books, old coats, and, disturbingly, a child's backpack still resting inside one. He reached for it, but just as his fingers brushed the fabric, he heard it. A sound. Asterisk soft. Careful. Close asterisk. Footsteps. Ethan froze. His pulse hammered in his ears. He turned his head slowly, scanning the hallway behind him. His flashlight flickered for a split second, and when it came back, he saw them. Footprints. Small. Childlike. Pressed deep into the dust. They hadn't been there before. He followed them with his eyes, heart pounding. The prints led further into the school, weaving between desks, disappearing behind a corner. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe a stray animal had gotten in? Maybe snow had blown in through a broken window? No, these were footprints. Bare footprints, and whoever had left them was walking toward him. The air grew heavier. The silence felt suffocating now. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. He took slow, cautious steps, following the prints deeper into the dark hallway. His own footsteps barely made a sound, but the ones he was following, they had stopped. His breath hitched. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. Then, just at the edge of his flashlight's beam, something moved. A shadow? A figure? It was gone before he could focus, slipping into the darkness like it had never been there. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run. But he didn't, because from somewhere up ahead, down the long, endless hallway, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The air inside the school felt colder now, biting at Ethan's skin as he moved down the dark hallway. His breath came out in thick, ghostly puffs, the flashlight in his hand flickering weakly. He had been inside for less than an hour, but something about this place made it feel timeless, like the walls held on to everything that had ever happened here. His footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing off the cracked walls. The deeper he went, the more he noticed little things, unsettling things. The classroom doors were open, but some swayed slightly, as if someone had just stepped inside. The old wooden floors creaked beneath his weight, but sometimes he heard a sound that came after his steps. A faint shuffle, like someone walking just behind him. He stopped, turned quickly. Nothing. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. Paranoia, that's all it was. He reached the end of the hall, where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. A brass plate, tarnished and barely readable, had the words Room 206, Detention carved into it. A gust of cold air slipped through the crack in the door, chilling him to the bone. Something told him he shouldn't go inside, but he pushed the door open anyway. The classroom was in complete disarray. Desks were overturned, chairs broken. The chalkboard at the front of the room was covered in scratches, deep, jagged lines as if someone had clawed at it over and over again. The windows were caked with dirt, allowing only a faint, eerie glow from the outside blizzard to seep through. Then, on the teacher's desk, Ethan saw it. A list. A single sheet of yellowed paper, covered in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Detention List. Below that, a series of names, written in ink that had long since faded. Some were crossed out. Others had red marks next to them. And at the bottom, his heart stopped. There, in fresh black ink, was a name that should not have been there. Ethan Carter. His mouth went dry. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Asterisk no. No, that's not possible, asterisk. His fingers trembled as he touched the paper. The ink wasn't just dry, it was cold, like it had been sitting there for years. He felt a pressure in the air, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. The whispers, which had been distant before, suddenly became clear. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Asterisk. A loud bang. The door he had entered through slammed shut. Ethan spun around, his flashlight flickering wildly. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. The desks creaked, as if something unseen was shifting the weight around them. Then, from the hallway outside, a voice. Not a whisper, not a child's voice. A deep, calm, authoritative voice crackling through an unseen intercom. Asterisk, Mr. Carter. You've broken the rules. Asterisk. The air turned freezing. The light above him buzzed violently before bursting, plunging the room into near darkness. Then the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, moving toward him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had to get out. Now. But as he lunged for the door, something moved in the shadows. A tall, faceless figure standing just beyond the faint light. Watching. Waiting. Detention had begun. The school felt wrong the moment Ethan stepped deeper inside. It wasn't just the chill in the air or the eerie silence. No, it was something far more subtle, like the building itself was watching him, waiting. He had come here seeking answers, but the questions he had were slipping away, replaced by a growing unease. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by the flickering lights overhead. He felt the weight of the shadows pressing in around him, making the walls seem tighter, closer, as though the building was slowly closing in on him. With each step, the floor creaked, and his breath came out in visible clouds, even though the heating system should have been working. Turning the corner, he noticed something strange. The hallway seemed longer than before. His eyes narrowed. There had been no turn in the path, no reason for it to stretch out so far. He took a few more steps, his boots thudding on the floor, the sound echoing louder than it should have. But the end of the hallway was still just as far away as it had been. Maybe I'm just tired, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. It had been a long day of driving through the snow, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He turned back toward where he had come from, expecting to see the end of the hallway, the doorway he had just passed. But there was nothing. The hallway behind him was gone. It was as if the school had swallowed it whole. In its place stood a solid brick wall where the door had been. Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. Okay, this is insane. He knew the building was old, decades old. But this was something else. His breathing quickened, and he spun around again. The hallway ahead of him now looked different. The walls were lined with lockers that hadn't been there before, and at the end, a door that hadn't been in his line of sight just moments ago. No, he whispered, his throat tight. He stepped forward, his boots clicking on the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the thick silence. The hallway stretched on, the lights flickering as though struggling to stay alive. But the door at the end remained tantalizingly close, the only sign of something familiar in the ever-changing corridor. Ethan's mind raced. He had to be imagining this. He couldn't just have walked into a room that didn't exist. But when he reached the door, it was locked, its rusty handle cold to the touch, refusing to turn. He tried again, shaking the knob in frustration. The door rattled, but didn't budge. His heart was pounding now, panic rising in his chest. What the hell is going on? He stumbled backward, only to feel his feet slam into something hard. A row of desks had appeared, stacked in a way that blocked his retreat. They weren't there before. They couldn't have been. Ethan blinked, looking around, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding around him. Every direction was wrong. The doors were shifting. The walls were rearranging themselves like some cruel trick of the mind. He turned and ran, his breath coming out in sharp gasps. He had to get out, had to find the exit. He moved down another hallway, the sound of his footsteps filling the silence. But no matter how far he ran, the hallway seemed to stretch forever, always too far to reach. The floor beneath him felt unsteady, as if the building itself were swaying, like a ship on a stormy sea. The walls pressed in closer with each step. Then he stopped, suddenly still. From the corner of his eye, he saw something that shouldn't be there, a figure standing just at the edge of his vision. He spun, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. I'm losing my mind, he thought, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. The air was growing thicker, harder to breathe. The school was playing tricks on him, messing with his perception. He had to stay calm. He had to keep it together. But when he took a few steps forward, the hallway before him shifted again. The door at the far end had vanished, replaced by a set of stairs leading up. No way he had missed that before. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't just his imagination. It was something else. Something alive. Okay, he said out loud, trying to steady his voice. I'm not going crazy. I'm not. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, caught his ear. His head snapped around, but no one was there. The walls groaned, as if the building itself were alive, breathing in sync with his racing pulse. The whispers grew louder, now clear. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Asterisk. Ethan froze. His eyes darted around the hallway, now impossibly long and winding. Was he hearing things? Or was there someone else here? A child's voice, a whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. He turned and bolted down the corridor, knowing there was no way out. There was no exit, no way to escape, not unless he faced whatever the school wanted him to. The walls shifted again, and with them, the dread that tightened in his chest. The silence in the school felt unnatural, pressing in on me like the cold, suffocating air of the blizzard outside. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the sound of my boots on the floor. There was something else, something heavier, following me, waiting. I turned another corner, hoping to find a way out. The front doors were too far back, the halls twisting unnaturally. It felt like I was walking in circles, each corridor leading me deeper into the heart of the school. The walls closed in around me, their faded wallpaper peeling and curling as if the building itself was alive, breathing. Then I heard it, a crackle, low, static. It came from above, from the ceiling, and I froze in my tracks. The intercom, it had been dead for years, right? The air felt thick now, vibrating with a low hum. The words that came next sent a cold shiver down my spine. Asterisk, Mr. Carter. You've broken the rules. Asterisk. My heart skipped. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The voice wasn't human. It was distant, almost robotic, but there was something in the tone that chilled me to the core. Like a warning. Like a threat. Before I could process it, a figure stepped into view. It was tall, too tall for any normal human being. Its shape was oddly familiar, yet its face was completely blank, an empty void where eyes should have been. The figure wore a suit, though it was old, the fabric frayed and torn in places, the sleeves ragged and stained with time. The suit seemed too clean, too out of place in the dust-covered, rotting halls of the school. It didn't match the atmosphere. Nothing here matched anything in the real world. The headmaster. He stood in front of me, his body stiff and unnatural, as if he was part of the school itself, something that had grown out of the very walls. "You've broken the rules," the voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the intercom. It was from the headmaster himself. The sound was hollow, as though he were speaking from deep within a cave, his words echoing endlessly in my mind. I took a step back, my breath quickening. What rules? I had no idea what he was talking about. The only rule I was following was getting to the truth of the school's history. But now, faced with this impossible being, all my skepticism crumbled away. This was no urban legend. This was real, and I was trapped in it. The headmaster tilted his head, the movement jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. I couldn't tell if he was looking at me, or if he was staring past me, into something far more terrifying. "Detention is permanent," he whispered. I tried to move. My legs felt like stone, rooted to the spot, my body refusing to listen to my mind's frantic commands. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was the fear creeping up my spine, crawling under my skin. The headmaster stepped closer. His long, skeletal hand reached out, fingers stretched wide, and I realized with horror that I could not escape. "You were warned," he said, his voice now sharp like broken glass. Asterisk, "You should not have come here." Asterisk. The room around me seemed to shift, as if the very walls were watching. My chest tightened. My mind raced. What had I done? I had to find a way out. I had to run, to escape whatever this was. I spun around, trying to find a door, any way out. But the hall was different now. The doors that were there moments ago were gone. I was trapped, a rat in a maze. The headmaster's footsteps echoed behind me. Slow, measured, relentless. I reached the door. It should have opened, but it didn't. My fingers pulled at the knob, and the door wouldn't budge, as though it was sealed shut by something far more sinister than wood and metal. "You're staying," the headmaster's voice drifted to me, cold and final. Asterisk, "The rules are not for breaking. Not here." Asterisk. I turned back, facing him, my body shaking. The hall felt like it was closing in, the darkness around me becoming thicker, more oppressive. The lights flickered above, buzzing erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows that made my skin crawl. The whispers returned, not from the children this time, but from something darker, something that wasn't human. The headmaster took another step forward. His face was still void of expression, but I could feel his gaze on me, sharp and unblinking. "You will learn," he said softly. Asterisk, "You will learn that there are things in this world that cannot be escaped. Not by you, not by anyone." Asterisk. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the fear in my chest felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on me. My hands trembled. My knees buckled. The school was alive. It was watching, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The last thing I heard before the world around me dissolved into darkness was the ringing of a school bell. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard, cutting through the silence with an urgency that felt like a verdict. The bell sounded final, and I knew, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be able to escape the headmaster's rules. The silence in the hallway grew thick. The air felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on me, refusing to let me breathe freely. The school had changed since I first stepped inside. The walls, once cold and indifferent, seemed to hum with something alive. I couldn't explain it, this oppressive, electric feeling that made the hairs on my neck stand up. But it wasn't just the silence that disturbed me. It was the whispers. They came softly at first, just a murmur that I thought was the wind, or maybe my own mind playing tricks on me. But then, they became clearer, like children's voices echoing from behind closed doors. Whispers that seemed to float just out of reach, brushing the edges of my sanity. "Mr. Carter," one voice called, barely a breath above the stillness. "Please help us." Another voice begged, this one shakier, as if it had been crying. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest as I turned toward the source of the sound. There was no one there. No one except me. The whispers were everywhere, bouncing off the walls, curling around the corners of the hallway. But the rooms I checked were empty. The classrooms were hollow shells of their former selves, filled only with shadows and dust. Yet the voices kept coming. More voices now. Follow the light. You'll be safe. Don't go. Stay with us. I couldn't make sense of it. I was surrounded by them. These voices, these children, but I couldn't see them. I wanted to scream, to run. But something rooted me to the spot. A strange, irresistible pull. The whispers were guiding me. I started walking. My feet felt like they were moving on their own, each step pulling me deeper into the building. The hallways twisted and turned, but no matter how much I tried to resist, my body followed the sound. It led me to the farthest corner of the school, a place I hadn't been before, a room I hadn't noticed. It was a classroom, its door hanging slightly open, but there was something different about it. A dim light flickered inside, not from a lamp or any source I could see, but it was there, hovering in the air like it didn't belong. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I pushed the door open. The moment it creaked, the whispers stopped. It was as if the room had swallowed them whole. Inside, the desk was covered in layers of dust, but there was something strange on top of it. A small, old attendance book lay there, its pages yellowed with age, but the ink on the front looked fresh, like someone had just written it. And then I saw it, in neat handwriting, scrawled across the top of the first page. Mr. Carr. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. My name, written there, right in front of me. My stomach twisted in a sick knot, the reality of it all sinking in. I flipped open the book, my fingers trembling. The names inside were familiar, some of them children who had gone missing from this school years ago. But what made my heart stop was the last entry. The newest name, written in fresh ink. Ethan Carter. I turned the pages faster, the whispers now returning, louder, like an urgent call. But all I could see were more names, more victims, lost to the school, swallowed by time, never to be seen again. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air, as clear as day. It came from behind me, a voice so real it sent chills down my spine. Get out, the voice whispered, no longer faint, but commanding. I spun around, but no one was there. The classroom was still empty. And yet, I knew it wasn't. The light flickered again, this time in the corner of the room, a pale blue glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I stepped toward it, my feet moving of their own accord, drawn by that same pull. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed the air, the door slammed shut behind me, and the whispers came again, louder, frantic. Leave. Now. Before it's too late. The presence in the room shifted, like something was watching me. Something old, something angry. I didn't know how, but I could feel it closing in, its breath on my neck, its fingers trailing across my skin. The school was alive, and it had no intention of letting me leave. The trapdoor creaked open under Ethan's hands, as if the old wood were protesting the intrusion. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the room. The air smelled musty, heavy with dust, and the cold scent of mildew. Below, an old stone tunnel stretched into darkness, winding its way beneath the school. The faintest chill rose from the hole, inviting him to crawl into its depths. He hesitated. The school was alive with an eerie silence, but he knew he couldn't stay much longer. The headmaster was getting closer, and there was nowhere else to run. His heart pounded, but he swallowed his fear. It's just a tunnel, he told himself. It's the only way out. He lowered himself into the hole, his fingers brushing the cold stone walls as he descended. The ladder was rickety, but it held. Ethan's boots scraped against the rough wooden steps as he descended further into the dark. The air down here was cooler, the silence even deeper, almost suffocating. With every step he took, the tunnel seemed to stretch farther, as if the walls were shifting and elongating. He couldn't tell if it was his imagination or something far worse. His breathing quickened. It was difficult to see anything clearly, only flashes of his own face reflected in the weak beam of light. He reached the bottom and stood, his knees cracking with the strain. The tunnel stretched before him, narrow and low. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, and he had to move carefully to avoid tripping over stones that jutted from the earth. His pulse thudded in his ears, louder than his footsteps. The silence of the tunnel was absolute. Too absolute. Then a sound of soft scrape. Ethan froze. His breath hitched in his throat. The wall seemed to close in, a claustrophobic feeling seizing his chest. He held his breath, waiting, listening. The sound was barely there, just the faintest shuffle, as if something, or someone, was following him. But when he turned, there was nothing. No footsteps, no shadow. Only the tunnel stretching endlessly in both directions. A sense of dread crept over him, curling around his spine. He had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to stop now. He pressed forward, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his grip. The air here was colder, sharper. The walls seemed to press in tighter, forcing him to hunch lower. Each step felt heavier, as if the tunnel itself were trying to pull him deeper into its darkness. Suddenly, the sound came again. Closer this time. Scrape, scrape. The sound of something dragging, slow and deliberate, just behind him. Ethan spun around, his breath catching in his throat. He shined the flashlight down the tunnel, but there was nothing, only the stone walls and the unbroken path behind him. His pulse was racing now. The hairs on his neck stood on end. It's just the wind, he told himself, his voice barely a whisper. It's just the wind. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. This wasn't normal. Nothing in this school had been normal. He was no longer in control. The tunnel, this place, had its own rules, and they weren't his. Another scrape. This time, louder. Closer. Ethan's eyes widened in terror. He turned and ran. His footsteps echoed in the confined space, frantic, desperate, as if the tunnel itself was alive, urging him to hurry, to escape. He barely registered the jagged rocks beneath his boots, his heart racing, every breath a desperate gasp. The tunnel twisted and turned. It didn't make sense. The more he ran, the longer it seemed to stretch, as if it were an endless maze, stretching farther into the unknown. He was losing time, losing his mind. Then ahead there was a light, a pale, flickering glow, as if it were the distant promise of freedom. He pushed forward, every ounce of strength focused on reaching it. The tunnel narrowed further, forcing him to duck lower, his body pressed against the rough stone. His flashlight sputtered, then died. Not now, he thought, panic clawing at his chest. Please. He fumbled with the flashlight, shaking it in his hands, but it refused to work. Darkness surrounded him. All he could hear was his own rapid breathing, and that faint, dragging sound that was getting closer. He ran. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the tunnel opened up. He stumbled out into the storm, gasping for air, his body trembling from the cold and the fear. Snow whipped around him, biting into his skin. The storm had grown fiercer, swirling with angry winds that seemed to scream. He fell to his knees, hands sinking into the snow, gasping, trying to shake off the terror that clung to him. He looked back. The trapdoor was shut. The tunnel had disappeared. The school, its windows dark and empty, stood behind him, silent. Had it all been a dream? A nightmare? He wasn't sure. But as he stood and took a step away from the school, a strange feeling settled in his gut. The door might have been closed. The tunnel might have vanished. But something was still there, in the snow, watching him. And the storm, it was only getting worse. The wind howled around me as I stumbled into the thick snow, my heart pounding in my chest. I could barely see a thing through the blizzard, the storm blurring the edges of reality. My breath came out in shallow gasps, freezing almost as soon as it left my lips. The cold bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The school was behind me, looming like a shadow, and I wasn't sure if I was running from it or toward it. I kept my eyes trained on the school, the thing that had swallowed me whole only moments before. I had escaped, hadn't I? I'd made it out of that cursed place, out of the shifting halls, the endless maze of doors that wouldn't open, the whispers that followed me everywhere. I had seen the headmaster, felt the walls closing in around me. But now the school was standing perfectly still in the distance. I looked back once more. The school's shape was clear against the snow, standing as still as it had before the storm began. I had expected it to be different, to feel different, but it was unchanged. The same crumbling, desolate building. The same faded windows staring back at me like eyes that never blinked. A strange feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. My hands were shaking, too numb to feel, but I still reached for my camera, the one thing I had managed to hang on to during the chaos. My fingers fumbled with the buttons, too cold to work properly, but finally I got it on. I had to document this, to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the horrors inside, that the headmaster and the shifting halls had been real. I clicked through the photos, my eyes scanning the screen, but my heart dropped into my stomach. The images were all gone. Everything I had taken inside the school, the eerie classrooms, the shadows in the hallways, the pages of the attendance book, asterisk all vanished star. Every photo, every video, everything except one file. I clicked it open. It was an audio recording. My hands froze as I saw the file name. Intercom. I pressed play. The voice crackled through the speaker. A faint, distorted whisper, but the words were clear. Asterisk, you've broken the rules. Asterisk. I felt a chill run down my spine. The words echoed in my head, as if they were spoken directly into my ear. A feeling of dread washed over me, like a wave pulling me under. I glanced at the school again, still standing there in the storm, unchanged, unmoved. I turned around, hoping to get further from the place, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. My heart was heavy, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached into my jacket pocket, hoping to find something, anything, to calm my racing thoughts. My fingers brushed against something crinkled. A piece of paper. The detention list. My blood ran cold. I pulled it out and looked at the names. One by one, they were all there. The missing children. The ones who had vanished years ago. Their names were written in faded ink, but there was something else. My name was on the list, too. The date was today, but something else was different. Something new. There next to my name was a checkmark. I stared at it, my mind reeling. The checkmark was fresh, as if someone had just marked it down. The sound of the storm seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of my own heart. I felt like I was caught in the middle of something I couldn't understand. I looked back at the school. The wind howled, but there was no movement from the building. It stood silent, its windows dark and empty. The bell rang once more, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close. It was right behind me. I turned, heart racing, but the school was still there, silent, unchanged, and ever-present. And then I heard it, the whisper. Asterisk, you're not done yet. Asterisk. The snowstorm swallowed the sound, but I could still feel its weight pressing in on me. Something had followed me out. Something had marked me, trapped me here. I didn't know how long I stood there, just staring at the school, but time seemed to stretch, like I was waiting for something. Something inevitable. I could feel it, lurking in the shadows and the wind. The bell rang again, its toll like a countdown. And as the snowstorm continued to rage around me, I understood. The school was never done with me. It wasn't done with any of us. Not yet. Ethan stood in the blinding snow, his breath coming out in sharp, frantic gasps. The wind howled around him, biting through his jacket and chilling him to the bone. He could hardly see through the thick, swirling flakes, but he didn't need to. The school was behind him, its silhouette barely visible in the storm, standing still like a dark sentinel, watching him, waiting. He pulled the collar of his jacket up, trying to shield his face from the biting cold. His heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline still surging through him. He had escaped. He was free at least. That's what he kept telling himself. The weight of what he'd just gone through, a nightmare that didn't make sense, that he still couldn't wrap his mind around, was too much to bear. His hands shook as he reached into his jacket pocket, fumbling for the detention list. The piece of paper felt cold and heavy in his palm, as though it carried the weight of all the years it had sat forgotten in that cursed school. His fingers slid over the list, the edges frayed and worn from age. The faint, yellowed ink was barely visible under the moonlight, but it was there. His name, Ethan Carter. He could almost hear the whispers again, the soft, childlike voices that had guided him, taunted him, warned him. He could still feel the cold grip of the headmaster's presence in his bones, the weight of the entity that had followed him, watched him. He couldn't escape it. Not really. With a deep breath, Ethan squinted at the list. It felt wrong. His name was still there, printed neatly, but something had changed. A small check mark had appeared beside it, barely visible at first, but now it felt like it was searing through the paper, as though something, had just marked him, as if he'd belonged there all along. Ethan's stomach twisted. He took a step back, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. The blizzard seemed to intensify, the wind growing louder, the snow falling heavier. He tried to shake it off, to calm himself, but his heart raced. Something was wrong. This wasn't over. He could feel it deep in his gut. He wasn't free. I need to get away from here, he thought, but the storm was too fierce. The wind screamed in his ears, the world around him a blur of white. He could barely see beyond the tips of his own fingers. He looked up at the school, its windows dark and empty, staring back at him. Was it really gone? Was it still there, hiding in plain sight? He couldn't be sure. It was as if the school was waiting for him to come back, to finish something that had never been completed. The whispers, asterisk so faint now asterisk, echoed in his mind. The words he had heard before, a warning, a plea. You've broken the rules. A chill ran through him, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement behind one of the windows. A shadow, perhaps, or maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the thought of the headmaster still being there, or the possibility that the school, and everything inside it, had somehow followed him. Ethan turned away, his feet crunching in the snow as he took a few unsteady steps. He looked at the detention list again, his breath catching in his throat. The checkmark glowed brighter. And then, a distant, eerie sound cut through the howling wind. The school bell. It can't be, but it was. The low, mournful ring of the bell echoed out, cutting through the storm, as if the school was still calling him, still marking him, still waiting for him to return. He stumbled back, his heart thundering in his chest. The snow around him seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the scent of decay, of something ancient and wrong. He had broken the rules, and now there was no escape. The school had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others. Ethan's hands went numb, the paper slipping through his fingers as the snow swallowed it. He didn't look back as he turned and ran, the storm devouring everything in his path. He couldn't stop, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he knew was that he had to get away. The storm would take him, and the whispers would follow, but he couldn't stop running. Behind him, the bell rang again, and this time, it felt like the beginning of something new. Something worse. Ethan didn't stop running until the sound of the bell was nothing more than a distant memory lost in the blizzard. But the checkmark was still there, and he would never escape.